thank you for choosing to spend the next hour together. Entrepreneurship is not something that most people really understand. Entrepreneurship has many misconceptions and myths. A really common one is that entrepreneurship is about thinking up a brilliant idea, pitching it to strangers so that they hand you lots of money. It's sort of like Shark Tank here in the United States. But entrepreneurship is really nothing like Shark Tank. And the true story of perhaps the greatest idea of the 20th century is an excellent illustration of why this is a misconception. So it's the story of the transistor. As soon as the transistor was invented, people knew it was going to change the world. It made the front page of the New York Times. You know, it's brought us today computers, modern communications, the internet, smartphones, and all the ubiquitous electronics that we've come to rely upon. The transistor was invented by someone who was universally recognized as being one of the greatest engineers of his era. His name was William Shockley, and he wanted transistors to be his legacy. And so he quickly formed a startup. He raised lots of money, and he recruited the smartest people to join him. And because he was boss, he decided to set up his company to be near his mother. So he moved, along with all the smart people, to Palo Alto, California. And so Silicon Valley is where it is today because of William Shockley's mom. So all the smart people were moved in. They had the greatest equipment at their fingertips. They knew more about this technology than anybody else. And the world was waiting with bated breath to buy these transistors. And nothing happened. William Shockley, he routinely belittled his recruits in front of their peers. He would go to the lab technicians and tell them, ignore your boss, secretly report to me for your work instructions. He took credit for everybody else's ideas. And it didn't take long, about a year, before the smart people started to flee. And those smart people that fled, well, they went on to create the pioneering companies and venture capital firms like Intel and Kleiner Perkins that we now associate with Silicon Valley. The Shockley Semiconductor Company never produced a single device. Ultimately, William Shockley was a leadership disaster, and he set back the electronics revolution by years. It wasn't until competent leaders took over the most important idea of the century that actually progress could be made. The crux of entrepreneurial success is not the brilliant idea, no matter how much money is in back of it. Here's another misconception. Today, many people feel unless you're a coding savant that doesn't sleep, you really can't compete as an entrepreneur. Well, what the data shows, the real data, is that the chances of success of a coding savant that doesn't sleep is about the same as for the rest of us. So, what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur? Well, I'm going to illustrate with my own story because, as is true with all successful entrepreneurial stories, it was a harrowing experience. It was spring of 2000, and I got a call from what was then the headline customer of the company that I had formed the year before, iSupply. It was a Friday afternoon, and everything had been going very well with that customer up to that point. We were providing a pretty sophisticated service for them. We were monitoring and managing their supply chain of their most difficult and hard to source parts. Parts that could take up to a year to find and to get delivered. And we had the information and specialized supply chain processes that allowed us to source these parts in about half the time. And that's a valuable service. But the executive vice president of our client was calling that day to inform me that they had just figured out they had given us all the wrong information. He said, You have to throw out all the work that you've been doing for the last 5 months getting us parts. And here's a new list of equally hard to find and source parts. And you have exactly 1 month to find them for us. He went on to say that his company, a large global electronics company, would not be able to make their financial projections if we didn't find these parts in the next 4 weeks. And that if they didn't make their financial projections, they would publicly blame us. So the implication was clear. If we didn't perform a miracle for them, they would ruin our reputation. Now, that scared the shit out of me. I was trembling, I was worried, how are we going to survive? I had founded iSupply by retiring as a successful CEO of a large global semiconductor company. And I formed iSupply because I wanted to prove to the world that I knew how to make the electronics world operate more efficiently. So if I was going to be publicly blamed for making things worse rather than making things better, I would fail. And nobody would ever listen to me again. And that thought scared the hell out of me. And the thought of that hell, well, that's what gave me the energy to do whatever it would take to overcome and to make things right. Now, by the next morning, we dispatched a team to Asia, 2 teams to Europe, to scour every possible location where we could find and source these parts. We set up 24/7 coverage back home, and 24 of us worked 18-hour shifts for the next 4 weeks. Well, we found the parts in time. And we ultimately prospered from the experience and the reputation that it created for us as miracle workers. But that was just one of many scary and unexpected crises that we had to overcome in order to make iSupply a big success. If we hadn't succeeded at each and every one of them, then the company wouldn't have amounted to very much, and I wouldn't be standing before you here today. So ultimately, startups and crises, they go hand in hand because entrepreneurs are doing things to be better and different. Yet being different means that you're doing things that are new and untried. A crisis happens when you expect something to happen which doesn't. And therefore, entrepreneurs need to overcome many, many crises as they grow their enterprises to be self-sustaining and to produce significant value. Most entrepreneurs fail as leaders. The vast majority of entrepreneurs fail as leaders. They fail to excite customers with their vision. They fail to assemble strong and competent teams. They fail to keep their teams together under pressure. So entrepreneurial success is not about a brilliant idea, an impressive business plan, or ample funding. Assembling and leading and keeping together teams of people who are dedicated to seeing your vision become a reality. Now, let's go over what that really means in terms of most entrepreneurs fail. Well, let's take 60 entrepreneurs at random, and they're all aspiring to create a company. Only 1 in 3 will actually get to the point where they've created a company. At that point, your chances of actually figuring out how to make your customers happy with what you're going to do for them, with your product and service, well, that's about 50-50, maybe 50-50. And then after you've figured out how to make your customers really happy with what you do for them, your chances of figuring out how to be financially rewarded for that are only about 1 in 10. And that translates into odds that are worse than 1 out of 50 for ultimately being a successful entrepreneur. Now, when you take those facts and you add to them the fact that about half the population will attempt to be an entrepreneur at some point during their working career, and you can see we have a really big problem. Now, the good news is it doesn't have to be that bad. Just learning a handful of specific skills that you can practice and get decent at multiply your chances of success many, many fold. And the further good news is that these skills, they apply way beyond the workplace. And they allow you to lead through all types of crises. Leadership skills are the thing that all successful entrepreneurs have in common. Recently, I had a chance, a real honor, to speak to one of the great entrepreneurial leaders, Miss Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America and Teach for All. Wendy thought up the idea for Teach for America as a senior at Princeton, and the idea excited fellow students, and she was able to get some small seed funding from some business leaders. And fortunately for the hundreds of thousands of children around the world that have benefited from Teach for America and Teach for All, Wendy took it upon herself to understand how to be a leader early enough in the formation of Teach for America that she was able to overcome some very common entrepreneurial missteps. So here's what Wendy had to say.
It's been an incredible journey, but one that I feel very privileged to be a part of. We've come to see that so much of this is about leadership development. I happened upon an idea that I am obviously very passionate about. And that idea also magnetized a whole lot of other people. And I feel like I've just been pursuing the journey very openly, reassessing constantly what's working and what's not, in pursuit of that idea fulfilling its potential. If I was left to my own devices, I would probably be in very small groups or by myself. But as you say, I mean, that's not realistic. And I think I've probably pushed myself to just try to feel comfortable in who I am. Like, I don't need to be the most outgoing person in the room. I can just be centered in who I am and approach everything as a learning opportunity. You know, you're listening to others and engaging and trying to maximize every opportunity to take things forward. So I've probably become more comfortable over time, but not entirely. It's not my natural nature. There were points along the way, especially in our early years, where I just thought there was no chance I was going to be able to lead this to the place it needed to be. And the only reason that I stayed and went through the learning curve to evolve myself to be able to do it was because I could not find another option. But having done it, I just know that others could do it. This is so much about building the capacity within the organization so that it doesn't all go to one person. I can shape my life. I can shape how I spend my time, and that's one of the advantages of being an entrepreneur. I spend an enormous amount of energy figuring out how to spend my time. There's just an immense diversity in what I do. Every hour is precious. That's really the mindset that I have brought to this, and I think that accounts for the evolution as well. It's just the constant reflectiveness and creating the personal space for reflection. We've really learned that it is possible to solve this problem. I mean, truly, I've seen whole schools take whole buildings full of the most marginalized kids and put them on a path to truly fulfill their potential. I've seen whole communities make meaningful progress in expanding the opportunities for the most disadvantaged kids. I've seen whole countries make dramatic progress. So we know it can be done. What I've also seen is that always, without any exceptions, leadership is at the core of the solution. Always, it's because of the leadership. And yet we spend so little time thinking, okay, how are we going to develop the leadership to really take this to scale? It was just one of those things. I mean, the timing was so perfect. The mood on college campuses, interest in corporate America to actually do something to improve education. There were massive teacher shortages in the country. I mean, I really believe that if I hadn't started this, someone else would have come to it and done it within 6 months, because it had to happen. And so it was very quickly far beyond me. And within 1 year, we had placed 500 teachers in 6 communities across the country. And that was really the beginning of the real learning curve and journey that has gone on now for ever since.
So creating an enterprise that delivers value and is self-sustaining is an immensely difficult task. And it's made even trickier by the entrepreneur having to perform the seemingly contradictory balancing act of being totally selfish while also being totally selfless. The desire to be an entrepreneur, whether it's leading a for-profit or a not-for-profit, arises out of selfishness. After all, you're asking the world to change and to do so as you see fit. Selfishness is also what delivers that energy that you absolutely require to lead you and your teams through those multitudes of crises. That selfish ambition, well, that's a message to others that you're dedicated to your mission, that you have the tenacity to win, and people latch on. I was selfish in forming iSupply because I wanted to prove to the world that I knew how to run the electronics industry better than anyone else. And that translated to others that joined me that I had vision, that I had drive, that I had courage. And that was a really essential thing for assembling that strong and bonded team that was dedicated to my mission. Wendy was selfish in forming Teach for America. And 500 of the best students from the best universities latched onto her idea within that first year. But being in the same room with someone is totally different than sacrificing and being led through fire by that someone. Ultimately, nobody's going to make huge sacrifices for your vision to come true if they don't feel that it's going to ultimately lead to their own success. So a leader has to make it clear to her team that she is going to work to put their success ahead of her own. My team would not have canceled family vacations to work 18-hour shifts because I was selfish and I worked hard. They felt it would pay off for them, for things that they selfishly wanted for themselves. And not just monetary things. They wanted belonging and recognition and support and help in acquiring new skills. Ultimately, a leader cannot rise beyond mediocrity without being selfless. Now, how do you do this? How do you do this very tricky balancing act that's made even trickier by the constant flux of a startup? Well, ultimately, what research shows is that it comes down to proficiency in 5 skills. Those skills: self-awareness, relationship building, motivating others, leading change, and fifthly, a skill that I call enterprise basics. Self-awareness is what we as leaders require to understand our own competencies and quirks so we know when to ask for help. Without self-awareness, we have no idea about what is our actual impact on other people. Relationship building, well, that's the skill of creating new relationships and making existing relationships stronger. Because there's very little that we can accomplish on our own. And we have to build strong bonds with the people who provide us the experience, the resources, and the skills that we lack and have no time or ability to acquire. Motivating others, well, that's the skill of getting people excited to dedicate themselves to achieving your vision. We need to understand how to access the hearts, guts, and minds of diverse groups of people. Four-skill leading change arises because things change constantly and quickly in a startup, and yet it's the natural resistance to change that everybody has. As a leader, you need to understand how to help your teams overcome this resistance, or things don't change. And fifthly, the skill of enterprise basics. Well, that's just understanding how enterprises form, how they ultimately weave together the web of assets and actors, how they create value, how they ultimately become self-sustaining. And it turns out that there is a prescribed sequence of actions and milestones that are required to create value and to become self-sustaining. And that it's impossible to change this sequence, no matter who you are, without disastrous consequences, no matter what. Now, it turns out, if you lack even just one of these skills, your chances for failure skyrocket. Remember the 1 in 50 odds that I quoted a few minutes ago? Well, those odds include already experienced and successful entrepreneurs who have a very high chance of success once they start out. And it also includes those entrepreneurs that got wise to the fact that they needed these skills early enough in the formation of their startup that they could overcome their early missteps. Now, in my book, Startup Leadership, I profile an entrepreneur who failed at his first 4 attempts, but today is arguably New York City's most successful tech entrepreneur. His name is Brian O'Kelly. His company is AppNexus. AppNexus provides some very important technology to run the internet. It's profitable and growing really fast. And it's always been extremely challenging for AppNexus to grow as fast as all this business was coming in. And recently, I had the opportunity to reminisce a little bit with Brian about what it took.
I was a junior in my high school when the district got a bunch of grant money to upgrade all of their Apple IIs to Macs. The district said, if you can pay us $5 per computer and get them out of our warehouse in the next 2 days, we will let you have them. So a couple days later, we were driving across town with 400 or 500 Apple IIs in the back of a truck. And then every day after basketball practice, I think 6 of us would go over there and scrub, grow stuff off of them and test them. And we sold them out of the garage for $75 to $125 a pop. And that was the beginning. I'd sort of gotten hooked on this idea that I could just make money. By the time I graduated from Princeton, I was ready to start a real company. I was 21. I was old. Yeah. A week after graduation, we had 30 people in an office in Los Angeles, and we're off building LAtonight.com. LA, the number 2, NITE.com. If you have to spell it, it's not great for radio. Learn that lesson. On campus, it was relatively easy to focus people. But when you're actually living sort of out in the real world, some people will go home at night. On campus, they don't. So there's a real cultural tension between, my vision for the company, which was we just work all the time, and perhaps the vision of some of the employees who were excited to be a week out of college and in LA with VIP access to some of the hottest clubs in the world. Right after we launched, we had a group therapy session because I was so low in emotional intelligence. I was just not understanding their needs, not empathizing with how they wanted to operate. It was sort of funny in hindsight that was what it came to. But, we didn't have any idea. We never had a conversation about how we'd run the company. We kind of had a business plan and some money and a website and, stuff to do. But all the other pieces of that, how to really think about building an organization or even building a team, were new for me, especially as a computer scientist who spent most of my time, sleeping under a table in the computer science building and, chatting online with my, collaborators. It was just a very different experience to be front and center for a company being built like that. So my first real startup lasted about 2.5 months before I got fired. I knew what I needed to learn. All these sort of basic business things that I'd never been exposed to. Things like how to hire, how to fire, how to manage projects, how to manage people, how to manage expectations and beat them, as opposed to oversetting expectations. Being consultative, really helping someone as opposed to selling to them. Now, at the start of my whole career, it was time to get a job. Out in Madison Square Park one day, the CEO and the CTO and I agreed that I would leave and join Right Media as their first engineer. We were at the beginning of this internet revolution, really, and just started asking dumb questions like, why do you prioritize everything in order? Why wouldn't you let computers decide what ad to show? And people are like, well, that's just how it's done. That's how TV works. Between when someone goes to a web page, or these days an app, and when you actually see the ad appear, in that 500 milliseconds, we could actually predict the response of the user to many different ads and make a far better decision. I think we served 1 billion ads in January of 2005, 35 billion in January of 2006, and 100 billion ads in January of 2007. It just went linear vertical. I went from managing myself to managing a team of probably 175 people around the world. I was in charge of engineering, product, technical operations, business development, and international. And sales. Did I say sales? I had 19 direct reports. I worked 24/7, but it was an amazing experience to take all the skills I learned over the first 8 years of my career and use them to go convince massive enterprises to use this technology from a tiny startup.
But they fired you.
Yeah, I am pretty good at getting fired. I spent most of my time on the road. The CEO and I, who used to be able to finish each other's sentences, kind of got disconnected. And so it kind of came to a head where we're in a room and he was trying to make me give up responsibility. And I said, look, let's be honest. Like, I run this company, not you. I should be the CEO. And he fired me, which, since I said that in front of 20 people, I think probably was inevitable. It cost me, I don't know, $10 or $12 million to get fired. I was pissed. I felt like he had stolen my money. It left me in a very bad spot because for everyone else outside the company, I was fired. I was persona non grata. I didn't have a reputation that was particularly positive. And in September, I started AppNexus. Thanks to all these failures and firings, I actually have a pretty good sense of where my weaknesses were. Having 19 direct reports doesn't really work or scale. I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a CEO, I saw a CTO. Mm-hmm. I saw a really good CTO. I saw someone that could start companies and found them. But I didn't see someone that could really be the face of a global organization. I'd never done it. I had a therapist I was working with at that time, just on some of my own frustration with all I'd been through, and just talking about some of the interpersonal relationships that at work, were difficult. And then I just sort of recruited coaches, people who I trusted, who could give me feedback. But some of that was also just starting to really recognize just the skills I was missing, the amount of time I've spent trying to be better at leadership and just being a human being to all these folks is, the difference between that CTO in the mirror and, being at least somewhat comfortable that I can be the CEO of the company. Even though, given my choice, I would still write code and have 19 direct reports and just say, let's go as fast as possible and let's not talk about it. It just doesn't work. I kind of feel like an adult in a way, like really focused on other people and their happiness and success in a way I would never have associated with the CTO guy in the mirror. And actually, I bought the whole company, your book, when it came out. One of my favorite parts about the way you characterize leadership is that it's not just starting a company. This idea of understanding the firm, understanding yourself, asking fundamental questions that not just the founder, but everyone needs to ask. How do you get 10 people to fulfill the needs of a client in 7 weeks? How do I interact with people? What kind of leader do I want to be? How am I going to think about the structure of a firm? A lot of people need to see the human side, the leadership side. And that's very, very practical. But they're lessons that aren't well taught or even well discussed if you read the vast majority of startup literature, which is all about the glory of the founder and the sort of practical things about how to build a product and how to hire a technical co-founder. Turns out hiring the technical co-founder is not nearly as hard as maintaining a positive relationship with said co-founder over the course of an 8-year sprint marathon. And that's where I think leaders come from.
So becoming a successful entrepreneur is indeed a journey. And so I've made a map. And this map goes into the next layer of understanding so that you can actually apply this out into the real world. Now, I hope you find this map interesting and take it with you. I think it's as interesting as the map that comes with Lord of the Rings myself, but that's a personal preference. But the map, the top section, goes over the 5 skills that I just outlined for you. But it goes in the next layer of understanding. So take self-awareness, for example. Self-awareness is understanding our capabilities as a person. And our capabilities are a combination of our motivations, our traits, and our skills. Our motivations, well, they're the innermost desires and fears that drive all our actions. Traits are psychological and physiological characteristics that we're born with or that develop very early in our lives. Things like whether or not we're right-handed or left-handed, but also whether or not we're okay being led by our instincts or whether or not we prefer to be led strictly by the facts. Now, skills are an ability to perform a prescribed task, like long division or cooking a souffle. And we each have a multitude of skills, and we can acquire new skills with practice and with coaching. And that includes the 5 basic skills of startup leadership. The next section is about how you mobilize to be a successful entrepreneur. You need to do an inventory of your motivation, traits, and skills, and then you need to commit to a plan to achieving and acquiring those skills that you lack. And also to make sure you get those skills that you need to be a credible entrepreneur in the market that you plan to tackle. I call this a personal leadership strategy, and there's a workbook that we handed out to help with this exercise, and I'll describe it in just a minute. Once you've done your personal leadership strategy, well, then you're prepared to put together a real plan and strategy for creating your enterprise. Now, that's going to come down to answering basically 10 important questions. With those answers in hand, you're ready for your entrepreneurial thrill ride. Now, just as a person needs to mature, so does an enterprise in order to get to a point where it's actually creating value and it's self-sustaining. It turns out it needs to go through 4 stages of development. And each stage requires a different balance between the selfishness that you show and the selflessness that you show. Unfortunately, just as you get comfortable with this balance, you get to the next stage, and bingo, it starts all over, and you have to slog your way to creating a whole new balance. Now, this is the worksheet that's also was handed out, and this leads you through some basic questions to determine whether or not being an entrepreneur is the right thing for you. And I'm not here today to say that entrepreneurship is for everyone. I refuse to say that it's okay to accept the loss of money, status, and relationships that can come with a failed enterprise. I think we can do a lot better. This exercise helps you understand what are your core motivations? What are those essential, burning, selfish desires that are going to help you power through all that you need to see your enterprise achieve its potential? Now, once you understand your true core motivations, then it's a small price to pay to learn these skills if you realize that they're going to help you achieve something that is critically important to you. These skills are something that are a small price to pay for vastly increasing your odds of being successful as an entrepreneur. Now, you may go through this exercise and figure out, hey, being a doctor or an artist or maybe a corporate type is really what aligns with my core motivation. So it's a worthwhile exercise no matter what. Now, you don't learn a sport by reading a book. You learn it through practice and good coaching. And the same is true for learning the skills of startup leadership, you need practice. Now, you don't need to start a company to practice. These are skills that you can practice without forming a company. And indeed, that's what we do in my class at Princeton, is we learn these skills and we practice them. And we're really fortunate today to have with us two former students to share their experiences in learning and practicing these skills. Annie Cardinal lives here in Austin, Texas. She landed a dream product design job. Guillaume Delepine, well, he's flying around the country as a consultant for KPMG. Welcome, guys, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Thank you.
So Annie, what's it like being out in the real world? Is it really different than the things you learned in school?
I think I had a lot of preparation, thanks to you. But it's kind of a dream to be working in my field. I majored in mechanical engineering, and being able to actually work in a creative form of mechanical engineering straight out of college, I don't think would have happened unless I had this preparation in kind of seeing myself as a leader and figuring out what I really wanted to do. I could have easily signed up to work at a large aerospace company, but that's not what I wanted to do. So I think knowing that I had these skills and these strengths helped me kind of narrow in on it and just push for finding the job that I really wanted.
So Guillaume, I mean, you're in a very high-pressured business. How are you using these skills?
Well, I'm in strategy consulting. We work a lot with big tech companies to take them from kind of value players into being exciting growth companies again. So, as you might infer, our job is either to come and fix a crisis or to cause a crisis. And as you do that, you're doing that with teams of 3 to 5 people that you've never worked together with before. They might come from a different office or even a different country. You're working with a client you've never met before on a problem that you've never tackled before. And as you do that, you need to come up with a vision, and the whole team needs to align on that vision. And a team doesn't align on the vision because one person decides they're going to. So leadership is really the job of the entire team. And even as a first-year associate, just kind of getting my way out there, applying these skills has been extraordinarily helpful in just working well with my team, with my clients, and making sure that we can all get aligned and deliver a product at the end.
So which skills, Annie, have you been using?
Honestly, I think the number one skill I learned from your class is how to run an efficient meeting. And you might think, meetings, like, we have meetings all day, it's not important. But if you're spending lots of time in meetings, you're doing it wrong, honestly. Since I work as kind of a consulting product designer, we have clients who come to us and ask us to help them create a product, make their dream a reality. Maybe we only meet with them once a month for an hour. And if we can't use that time efficiently, they're behind schedule already, under budget and out of time. So learning to make an agenda beforehand and how to direct the meetings so that we use the time most productively is really important. I also use this when I have design reviews with my boss. I know his time's very valuable, and so I jot down a couple things I want to make sure I cover, and that just helps direct everything.
So Guillaume, which skills have proven to be useful to you?
Well, I think for me it's pretty easy. The number one is understanding social interactions in the workplace. So a major skill or an approach that we learn in the class is that there are 3 things you can really do when you enter an encounter with another person. You can compete with them, you can retreat from the interaction, or you can choose to cooperate. And if one person chooses to compete, it's going to be competitive. If one person chooses to retreat, it's going to be competitive. But if both people choose to cooperate, that's when things really start getting good. And if you can just think about that to yourself and consider how your approach is going to change and how you can bring out a cooperative approach in the other party by finding something that you both mutually want to work towards, you can really see the difference in your teams, even without being in charge and kind of laying down the law.
So is this a theoretical thing, or does this actually work out in practice? Do you explain this to people and say, do we cooperate or do we compete? Or how do you apply that?
Well, absolutely not. That's extremely competitive, as you might imagine, right? So you don't want to be the know-it-all who's telling everybody, 6 months out of college how to go and live their lives. That's something that I'm told people hate about my generation. But what you do is you just think, well, okay, I'll give you a good example. I had another associate on the project, and we were both first associates. It was our first project that we were each working on. It's an extremely cutthroat industry, strategy consulting, so there's always that risk that things aren't going to gel. Turns out the two of us both really wanted to get through it. We really wanted to coach each other. Our skills were complementary. We found that I was good with PowerPoint, he was good with Excel, he's the smarter one. And we ended up finding a really good cooperation. We got each other through the project, and now we're really good friends. If we had come in and said, I'm going to be the best associate on this project, I'm going to get the highest bonus at the end of the year, that whole project would have fallen apart. There's no way that we would have gotten through, a really, really hard project that we had to go through and do. So it's not something that you're stating overtly, but if you just kind of trust me on this one and try it for yourselves, I think you'll find that it helps a lot.
So Annie, what have you found in terms of actually using these things?
I think they're really important, especially since I work face-to-face with the clients who are, giving us money to help them create this product, and they're putting their trust in us. Knowing about these different interactions and helping come up with shared objectives is very useful, because it's easy as an engineer to be like, no, this is the right way to do this. It won't work if you do it that way. But that's not something you can just tell your client. So understanding kind of their side of the situation, being able to empathize with them and figure out, okay, how can we cooperate so that you get what you want and I know that I can sleep tonight and know that it won't fall apart.
Are these things that you think other people can learn, or does it require going through the class?
I think you can learn it. I think once, if you read the book, or if you just kind of, look at relationships in your workplace, and instead of thinking about it from your perspective, also kind of consider the other point of view and think about why are they motivated? What can I be doing differently in order to make this a better relationship? And constantly questioning that is very useful.
Do these skills get noticed?
I'm not sure that they get called out specifically. It's more just the way that you interact with your team members. You're not going to get somebody coming over and patting you on the back and say, hey, you're really great at enterprise basics. But you will find that people, appreciate the approach that you can bring to the table. And you'll find that your interactions with your teams and your team members will be a lot more positive and eventually a lot more fruitful.
Have there been real challenges in applying this? It's, oops, or, something that you would advise people to, beware of?
It's a journey for all of us, right? And certainly at age 22, I'm not the expert on entrepreneurial leadership, and I don't think anybody is. You don't want to be. What is important is not to get discouraged and to revert back to the previous way that you did things. And something that helps me a lot is to go and pick one skill at a time, and I say, hey, let me think through how I'm applying this skill. How have I applied it well this week? How am I going to apply it better next week? And a lot of times, there are a lot more ways to apply it better than there were ways that I applied it well. So, in that sense, I would say there's always room for tweaking. It's not necessarily going to blow up in your face. I don't think these are high-risk approaches. We're not telling you that there's a really nuanced way to yell at your employees and they're going to love you if you do it right. But definitely a way to continually improve if you just stick with it.
Yeah, and I think one example I have is when I first started at my job, I really wanted to prove myself. I would go into meetings and not be a know-it-all, but just kind of try to show that I knew stuff about engineering. And I soon realized they didn't hire me because I know things about engineering. They hired me because I can learn things about engineering. I really didn't know very much coming straight out of college. So kind of having that self-reflection and figuring out how to readjust myself to being more of an observer and learner helped me become a better leader for myself as well.
So what are your aspirations?
My aspirations?
Yeah, what do you hope?
I just want to design great products and work on really smart teams with interesting people.
Cool. For me, it's about developing as many skills as I can, becoming really effective, and then taking those skills and applying them to global humanitarian problems. And a lot of people will say that I'm a sellout and I'm working in industry, but trust me, I'm getting there.
Have you come to terms with your own sources of selfishness?
I think so. It was easy for me to try and be a sellout, I guess, and work for a company that I didn't really want to work for. But it could be considered selfish for me to kind of hold out and wait for the right job instead of just taking what I could have gotten earlier. But I think the fact that I'm happy now with what I do is proof in itself.
Yeah, and I think if you look at history, so many fantastic, incredible things have happened thanks to selfishness. And the example that's always brought up in class is if you're an entrepreneur and you were to come to one of us and say, hey, I've got this great idea, I think it's going to change the world, it's really important. And we said, well, what if we take that same idea, we give it the same amount of money you have, the same team that you have, but we let somebody else be in charge of it? How would you feel? If you can't take that personally, you really don't have the drive to go and get this done. And so kind of recognizing selfishness, keeping it under control, but also appreciating it and nurturing it and not being afraid of it, I think are really valuable things.
Super. Well, thank you so much for sharing today, how this works out in the real world. I really, really appreciate it.
Of course, and thanks for teaching us all kinds of tricks.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
So, being a successful entrepreneur does not hinge on a revolutionary idea. It hinges on leading rapidly evolving enterprises. And entrepreneurial leadership is about how you balance this core selfishness that you have to tune into with the selflessness that's required to assemble strong and competent teams and keep those teams highly motivated to achieve your vision. And that's constantly challenged by the flux of a startup. And it requires proficiency in 5 skills. Now, the easiest thing to do if you lack just one of these skills is to do nothing. Nothing risked, nothing lost, and that's what most people do. But in today's world, that's not really necessarily a choice anymore. Because modern life today is more and more at the bottom about entrepreneurialism. Your friends, your best friends could start a company and ask you to join or to invest. You may decide that you need to help save the world from burning up or how to educate children better. You could lose your job, or your favorite boss could be replaced by someone you can't stand, requiring you to decide whether or not being your own boss is the right decision for you. Now, we all want some combination of the fortune, fame, and control over our lives that we associate with successful entrepreneurs. And those are noble aspirations because we, after all, live in a society that counts on successful entrepreneurs to bring innovation, to grow and create jobs, and grow the economy. So, fortune, fame, and independence are the entrepreneurial bait our society uses to convince us to change ourselves and to take risks. So ultimately, you need to decide. Are you going to deal with entrepreneurship before it deals with you? What are your motivations? And if you do decide to be an entrepreneur, then decide to be a successful one and start working today on what we talked about to become an entrepreneurial leader. Go forth and change the world. Thank you.